and welcome to the webcast of From the Biblical Files of Dr. Mike. I am your host, Dr. Mike. Well, today we are continuing our two-part webcast. The first part of it is always going to be women in the Bible. And today we're going to take a look at the bride in the Song of Songs. That's part one. And part two, we'll take a look at blacks in the Bible. We will do a review of an article um, called They Were Not White. And we'll be talking about the bride in the narrative that is a women's focus today. The biblical source for our talk today comes from the book of Songs, also known as the Songs of Solomon or the Canticle of Canticles, and it has a Hebrew subtitle also. The Song of Solomon celebrated a kind of union between a man and a woman becoming one. It's a ballad of love and longing. It's an exchange of love notes. It's a story of adoration, satisfaction, delight, and sexual desire. It's a tale of a young woman preparing to marry her love, a handsome gentleman who adores her. They describe their emotions, their passions, their appearance, their fears. Their vulnerability is on display because their love and desire for one another sometimes seems rather graphic. And you ask yourself, how did this particular book make it into the Bible? Well, why is the Song of Solomon so important? Well, this book remains singular within the Old Testament for at least two reasons: the character as a single poem and its subject matter, particularly the frank discussion of love between a married couple. The Song of Solomon's willingness to broach the topic of physical love within marriage has made many of its readers throughout history uncomfortable, so much so that rabbis have vigorously had to defend the book's placement in the Jewish canon, even as late as AD 90 at the Council of Jeddah. But as a testament to the beauty of marriage and the relationships thereof, in the fullness, the Song of Solomon or Song of Song stands out with its uniquely detailed vision of this beautiful reality. The Song of Songs is the 23rd book of the Christian Old Testament. It is the last of the book characterized as the writings placed after Ecclesiastic and preceding the biblical prophets, beginning with Isaiah. Origen was the premier Christian theologian of antiquity who fought for the placement of this book. He wrote extensively on a number of different topics, not the least of which was this particular book of scripture. It should be noted that there were others who wrote extensively on the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. In fact, one renowned Hebrews wrote at least 86 sermons on the one book, um, and I can see where that could be done. However, back to Organ. In his commentary, Organ says that the book is a marriage song written by Solomon in the form of a drama where the wise king speaks from the point of view of a bride who is burning with the desire for the word of God, in this case represented by the figure of the bridegroom. What is more, McGann points out that Oregon was also the first to associate the bride with the church and the bridegroom with Christ. In such a way, it is like the book telling a story of the soul of every Christian who is seeking after the Lord in order to achieve a loving union with Him. The Song of Songs does not explicitly name Solomon as the author, though he and the woman that he called his beloved or the beloved, are traditionally held as main characters in the story. The events surrounding the Song of Songs are uncertain, though the book is connected with the legacy of the wisdom literature that began with Solomon. Song of Songs is entirely poetry. It's not mixed with prose at all. It is poetry. It is. I love the way that one of the authors says that you have a duet with a choir behind it. Um, it is one of the two books in the Bible that does not mention God. Uh, it is the fifth book of poetry in the Bible, and Solomon wrote 1,005 songs in his lifetime, according to First Kings 4th chapter 32nd verse. But this is the Song of Songs. This is in Solomon first chapter, first verse. Like Psalms, it's a book of lyrics, but while every psalm begins and ends is clearly marked, the Song of Solomon doesn't give us this level of clarity at all. The Song of Solomon's role in the Bible? Well, it's possible that the Song of Psalms has always been one grand piece that Solomon wrote. But it's also possible that Solomon explored, as we know that he loved to do, and arranged pieces of poetry from people uh, like Kohit in Ecclesiastes 12th chapter, 9 through 10 verse. The Song of Psalms may be a mega song, an anthology of smaller pieces. It could have been part of a collection that Solomon, did during this phase of his life, but it gives us a biblical look at human love. The characters experience attraction, love sickness, and what seems to be a pretty great wedding night as depicted in Solomon's 7. There are some almost X rated pieces in there. God is never directly mentioned, as I said earlier, in the original Hebrew version. The closest we get to the mentioning of God is in the last chapter where the bride compares jealous love to a blazing flame. That's in Song of Psalms 8 chapter 6 verse. That Hebrew word for flame literally means flame of the Lord, but could just mean as the as especially just a hot fire. Solomon's Song of Songs is an old book, but its portrait of powerful, all-consuming love probably resonates with most of us today. Many waters cannot quench love, nor will rivers overflow it. If a man were to give all the riches of his house for love, it would be utterly despised. Song of Songs 8 chapter 7 verse. It is a passionate description of human love. It's just a description of human love. We have first the preparation for the wedding, and that's chapters 1 through 3. Then the bride prepares for the wedding. We are still in chapters 1 through 3, verse 5. We have the groom preparing for weddings, chapter 3, verses 6 through 11. Then the couple professes their love and desire. The groom professes his love in chapter 4. The bride professes her love and longings in chapter 5. Um, Both are united in love in chapters 6 through 8. Now, Solomon uses many analogies in the Song of Psalms to describe the bride, comparing her cheeks to pomegranates and her hair to a flock of goats, to name just a few. They are strange descriptions to us because we're used to visual analogies, but to the original readers, this was very elegant writing. The structure of the Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs is arranged by character. Three parties join the song. The bride, as depicted, is depicted as a hard-working shepherd girl with a rough home life, and we find that in chapter 1, verse 6. The groom, the bridegroom, is a handsome and stately shepherd. The text doesn't explicitly say whether or not Solomon is the bridegroom, but the bride does reference Solomon's wedding parade. That's chapter 3, verses 6 through 12. The chorus, the community of people celebrating the bride and the bridegroom's love and union. If this were indeed an arranged song, you would have to think of it, as I said earlier, as a duet with the choir. Now let's take a deeper look into it, and we'll begin our interpretations of it. The Song of Songs is a well-known but little understood book in the Bible, made up of eight chapters of ancient Israelite love poetry. While there is an introduction and a conclusion, the book doesn't have a rigid literary design. It is a collection of poems that are not meant to be dissected, but rather read and enjoyed as a flowing whole. The first line in the book declares that it's the Song of Songs, which is a Hebrew idiom meaning that it's the holiest of holies or the King of Kings. It's a Hebrew way of saying that something is the greatest. The song is the greatest song of all. Thus, we have the Song of Songs. We also are told that the song is Solomon, which could be taken to mean that he is the author. However, as we read the poem, we find that the main voice belongs to a woman called the beloved, and while there is a male voice in the poems as the bridegroom, it's not Solomon. He is mentioned in the poem, but never as the speaker. You can go back and take a look at the song, chapter 3, verses 7 through 11, chapter 8, 11 through 12. And besides, you have to admit that Solomon would be an odd candidate to be the author, given the fact that he already had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So in First King 11, chapter verses 1 through 3, we get those figures. The contrast, this contrasts the two lovers in the Song of Songs, thus placing this in the wisdom tradition of Solomon, um, wherein he loved to learn and about every facet of life. He became known as the father of wisdom literature in Israel, and here his legacy is carried on through a collection of poems that explore the human experience of love and sexual desire. He disappears into the night, and she heads after him only to receive a hiding, perhaps actually a wound from the watchman. Now, when we do characters, we'll call him either the watchman or the sentinel, because she goes after him several times in this poem. The poet isn't naive. Harsh as the netherworld is passion. Thus, we see that the passage which we began as the key to these two episodes, for to the impetuous young woman, love is as strong as death. So this is actually a poem written for those who are mature. Later on, when we talk about other interpretations, you'll find out that there were rabbis who forbade Jewish men from reading this if they were under the age of 30. A peculiar book in the Bible, this Song of Songs is also known as the Song of Solomon. It is technically not a book at all. Keep in mind, it technically is a song. It is a song between two lovers. On its basic level of meaning, that is what it is. Uh, the interpretation includes several extravagant comparisons. For example, the woman is compared to a horse in Pharaoh's court. That's chapter 1, verse 9. And her hair is compared to a flock of goats. That's chapter 4, verse 1. It is helpful to remember that one, the comparisons are figurative rather than literal, and two, that the person has in common with what he or she is compared with a certain quantity or quality that is excellent, and it's the best of its kind. Remember when we talked earlier about Solomon and that the horses in Egypt were the best in the known world at that time? That's where we're getting some of that. The purpose of the Song of Solomon teaches God's wisdom on waiting for sexual intimacy and growing in marital intimacy. Please notice that we're talking adult things here. What are the themes then? Well, the themes are the power of love, love as an expression of wisdom, the gift of love from God, and then embedded within the song itself is that sex is a godly expression of love within marriage. Husbands and wives should appreciate each other's good points and compliment them. And thirdly, constant communication is important in maintaining a strong love in marriage. Love grows deeper over the years when both partners are loyal and committed to the relationship. There are themes of theology within this particular work also. If we take a look at verse chapter 1 verse 6, we'll see um, where work can be used for control and can humiliate, but it also makes a person feel so much stronger. And that one we'll read, do not stare at me because I am dark, because the sun has gazed on me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyard. My own vineyard I have not kept. We go on down to chapter 2, we'll see the time of singing or pruning has come, which means that work was meant by God to be a time of celebration. Moving on down to chapter 6, verse 2. My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of spices, to pasture his flocks in the gardens, and to gather lilies. The use of the agricultural imagery here describes a marriage that shows that the worlds of work that families enjoy are integrated into the healthy marriages. And then, last but not least, if one offered love all the wealth of one's house, it would be utterly scorned. In other words, love and labor that come put together in one's family provides a joy that wealth and leisure cannot. The working together, the coming together. So let's go a little deeper as we get ready to move into the much deeper analysis of the Song of Solomon. What we have here is the introduction of the young woman, the beloved, or the Shulamite woman, or just the shepherdess. We know that. She's not married yet to this courageous and handsome gentleman, but you think perhaps they are engaged. And the time period covered here is at least a year. And we'll go through and pick that particular point out when we take a look at the setting that we have. Um, we have so many themes, but we're going to stay with the ones that were mentioned earlier. The poem highlights the power and the intensity of love. It's a beautiful, consuming, and dangerous emotion. Like fire, it can destroy people if abused, but it can be life giving if protected and nurtured. There are so many of the little nuggets of truth within here. Ultimately, love expresses the insatiable human longings to know and to be fully known and desired by another. We are still talking, and I keep saying it, we're talking about an adult relationship. And we'll get down to the 8 chapters, say the 10th verse. Um, we see that if it is Solomon who wrote the poem, that it's important here because you cannot buy love. It's been mentioned earlier. It's impossible. It doesn't matter what your wealth quota is, you can't. The woman roundly rejects Solomon's offer, and the book concludes with the characters of the man and the woman separated once again and back on the hunt for each other. He calls to hear her voice, and that's the song in chapter 8, verse 13. And we can go down a little bit further, and we have, and she begs him to run away with him, and it goes on. It's open ended, it leaves the ending to the imagination, of the reader, and it was at one point considered written for the Jewish women. Um, but it's all of it is conjecture. But if we read it on a literal level, we have something that we can be really pleased with and accepting. Well, here's that setting. In its original translation, it is erotic poetry, and it's sometimes called out for being that. But the setting combines both the rural and the urban scenes. Portions of the poem take place in the hill country north of Jerusalem, where the Shulamites lived, and that's in the 6th chapter and 13th verse, and where Solomon enjoyed prominence as a wine grower and a shepherd. Ecclesiastes 2nd chapter, verses 4 through 7. The city section includes the wedding and the time afterwards at Solomon's abode in Jerusalem. Chapter 3, verses 6 and 7, as well as 13. Now, this is what I mentioned earlier. The first spring appears in the 2nd chapter, verses 11 and 13, and the second in the 7th chapter, verse 12. Assuming that the chronology is without gaps, then the Song of Solomon took place over a period of time of at least 1 year in length, but probably no longer than 2 years in length. Solomon wrote the book during his reign as king in Israel, meaning that he composed it sometimes between 971 and 931 BC. Now, those scholars who believe that Solomon is the author tend to agree that the song was written during his reign when he was actually a very young king because of the exuberance expressed in the poetry and because at the time his harem of women ex- had only 140. Um, that's mentioned in chapter 6, verse 8, which is relatively low in number when you compare it with the 1,000 in 1 Kings 11, chapter 3rd verse. Also, the author mentioned places um, in both the south of the country, including Lebanon and Egypt, reminding us of the relative peace and good relationships that existed between them early in Solomon's reign. Now, one of the persons I'd love to quote is Jack Zavala, and he believes that was written approximately 940 to 960 BC, and that it was intended for couples who were married and singles who were um, contemplating marriage. There's so much to be said about the Song of Solomon, the verses of the analysis of the poetry, and the fact that it fits into the wisdom books, not just because of the, the nature. So much of the nature is talked about, but it's the love that we have, the the images that we have of those persons. We can go line by line, and if we had to do characters, we would have the bride, who was the Shulamite, the groom, the brothers of the bride, the daughters of Jerusalem, who formed the course, the sentinels slash the watchmen, and then we had God, and we have Solomon. Now, the background to this is that these two people who dominate this either true life, dramatic love story, um, those persons are mentioned, they appear to have been quote unquote real people, although there's an argument that they were fictional, that Solomon wrote it from maybe listening to some of the women in his harem or some of the existing poems of the time. Some suggest that the Pharaoh's daughter, which he married in First Kings, 3rd chapter, and verse 11, is the woman that he's talking about. Others say it's the Queen of Sheba who came to visit. Still others favor Abishag, the Shulamite, who cared for King David, as in First Kings, um, 1st chapter, verses 1 through 4, and then 15. She was the unknown maiden from Shulam who had come to not become part of his harem or not to become a concubine with him, but to just keep him comfortable during his last days. She's sometimes referred to as the unknown maiden of Shulam. It is possible that there's that fourth person who was just the shepherdess that Solomon saw on a ride out during his stay in that area. but the minor friends are there. We find that these people who have the secondary roles are important because they allow the questioning, uh, but they don't really give the answers, nor would the bride and groom, who are so consumed with each other, actually hear the answers. Um, so that question about who is she, it's going to remain unanswered until additional work is done. Now, we have the Jewish way of looking at it. The woman is Israel, the man is God. We have, and their love is a symbol of the covenant between them and the giving of the Torah. Now, the Christians look at it this way, that the characters were wrapped into each other. It's about Christ's love for the people and the church. We have so many interpretations open to us. And we will take a look at the feminist one because there are those who believe that the author had to be a woman in order to present the, the profile of the bride, the character traits of the bride so well. But uh, the Christian husband's love for his wife is a symbol of Christ's love for the church. We are comfortable with that from that interpretation. As we go through it, we're able to see that if we take a look at the background but we're not to dissect it. Remember, we said the best way to understand it is to take it and read it as one flow of reading. But if we would take a look at some of the keeping in mind that this is not your normal one where you have the allegories, we have the visual things that are basically they're figurative, and we have to take it as that. Some of the works and some of the scholars have decided, and they have written that this is Solomon writing about his own courtship, or this is Solomon writing about the early days of his first marriage, through the good and the bad days of his life. And this is the maturing of a royal couple through the good and bad days of their lives. But the Song of Solomon expands the ancient marriage instructions that were given originally in Genesis, second chapter, verse 24, thus providing a spiritual music for a lifetime of marital harmony. And the song itself is undisguised frankness. It is definitely wisdom literature. It has it has lasted through the ages. The bride has been depicted in ways that, with even with the AIs today, I'm not sure they could come up with a better analysis. We have Dr. Oliver Tyrrell, who did an analysis of the Song of Solomon, and it's called it's referred to in this as romantic and erotic love between a man and a woman. Simple as that. Uh, the common title, Solomon didn't write it. Here's another scholar who says he didn't write it, but they believe parts of it were actually written by the female author, which we talked about earlier. Um, in this particular analysis, he points out um, how the bride really wanted to be kissed and loved and actually chased by the bridegroom. There's such a tongue-in-cheek play here, um, but the things are so beautifully written. There follow numerous comparisons, such as the bride and the bridegroom, who try to describe their beloved using suitable similes. My love is unto me as a cluster of campfire, and the metaphor, thou hast dove eyes. So the dove has always been associated with love, all the way up to Shakespeare. In chapter 2, verse 11, for lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone. And then in verse 12, the flowers appear on earth. The time of singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle is heard in our land. Here we have that passage of time. The fig tree putteth forth her green figs, and the vines with their tender grapes give a good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away with me. We have a lot of that. And for the record, turtle here is not referring to the hard shell reptile, but to the turtle dove, which is a symbol of romance. We have the discussion of the dreams and the role of the watchman. Here we have that chasing after, never being in the same place at the same time. Um, Very powerful dream sequence, not once but several times. The garden imagery, which goes back to the Garden of Eden, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. We have the woman, the beloved here, almost well actually put on a pedestal, you know, but we have to go back and remember the earlier works of Solomon. We need to go back and take a look at Lady Wisdom and Dame Folly. We have to go back and remember what was written in Ecclesiastic. We need to go back to Psalms 31, where we're looking at the woman, you know. Now, because again, most people have thought that Psalms 31, the woman, uh, was written for women, but this we know now, and we're comfortable with the research that says it was written for men to look for this particular type of woman as a wife. But if we keep it in mind that this was Israel's covenant tradition that we have here, we'll be able to take a look at it in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, in Ezekiel. You know, the covenant between the Lord and Israel as a marriage. Hosea, please, that we have the same kind of thing coming, the same kind of imagery coming. The one thing that we have to remember is that if it were Solomon who did the writing, he chose something that all were supposed to understand what a good marriage was, what were the characteristics, thereby transferring that over to God's love for his people, and especially in the Christian tradition. Excuse me. Excuse me. The Song of Songs is sort of like a victory celebration, and it's celebrating this romantic love. And if we go down to chapter 8, verses 6 and 7, we find the key that unlocks the poem. And we'll see then that the young woman, presumably a teenager, we would think, who is madly in love, will even risk going out at night, which was not safe, which gets her in trouble with the sentinels a little bit later on. Um, and there's this rejoicing in love all the way through, both for the male and the female, and the aspirations, the sense of hope that exists there. And if we can go down and take a look at all of these symbols and just not having to work hard at trying to make them more than anything other than what they are on paper, the dream, the nightmares, you will find a beautiful poem here that has nothing wrong with it, but has to be read in the way it was supposed to be read, shared with others in the way it was supposed to be shared. When we look at it as cantonal and cantonal, where it's being sung, then we have a situation where almost it becomes um, more powerful than it is when it's just read that way. Now, the first time we hear the bridegroom's voice, is that he addresses the bride as the fairest among women. Um, Black in her own sight, she may be hated too and persecuted by others, but as among women, as far as he's concerned, she is the fairest among women. Nothing will alter Christ's estimate of his people. What we're having here, if we're going to look at black in that way, we're looking at the value of God's work and how his people are responding to it. That we've had the shepherds and the lambs and the flocks before, where it's feed my sheep, feed my lambs. We have that. But the bride, who is the center of our focus today, she expresses the longing in her heart for that bridegroom. And as the days of love take over for her, it becomes an obsession. And it becomes one that says, Amen, even so, come, Lord Jesus. So we have um, the sexual sex according to the Song of Songs, which is laid out there. And again, we are looking at those who are mature enough to handle this. Is not written for, uh, even though they may have been teenage figures, because Solomon was rather young when he took the throne, ascended to the throne from David. But we also have to remember that um, that we have the, the lasting relationship that is going on here. There is a lasting relationship. The idea of marriage, um, especially the marriage to the Pharaoh's daughter, which was something he did, that didn't exactly please all the Jews because that's not really what they wanted to do. By the way, as you go through here, there's no mention of children. What we have is sort of an opposite presentation of women of that time. There's no, there's none of that taking care of the household. We have her working in an agrarian setting. Um, we don't have her training children or managing a household or any of that. It's rather interesting. It's sort of a throwback to a refreshing time when things were. And I guess that's why there's so many scholars who go back to the Garden of Eden when they're talking about this particular piece, this particular narrative in here. On a more feminine point of view, there are so many feminine. It seems like every feminist writer has written regarding this, and that is why I thought of that particular piece um, of how women are portrayed here. I don't get too much into the paradoxes and the things that sort of don't go well with each other, but let's take it for what it was and let's take it as instruction because the lessons that we have to learn, the principles that we can learn, um, intimacy, the principle of how to handle sex, the principle of beauty, there is loneliness, which is principle number 4, and principle 5 is love. Principle 6 is harmony, and principle 7 is enticement. And that's when we can go back and take a look at what had been written before and bring it forward. Because we're still talking about the character Solomon, whether he wrote it, whether he's a principal actor in it, or whether it was something that he wrote to be performed. We have been given background leading up to this particular piece. This is the young innocence that we have that is totally opposite the I have betrayed God and become a slave to many of the idols of the women that I've brought into um, Israel as my wife. So it's about a virtuous love between a man and a woman, showcasing 7 principles, those that we just named: intimacy, sex, beauty, loneliness, love, harmony, and entitlement. And these principles are um, they are directly related to human relationships and how they should be handled. They are. Um, the poems actually open up windows to the world of the unknown and unexplored, which is what the poet was trying to do. He's inviting us to love openly and passionately with all of our being. It moves us beyond the rational to engage all that is meant to be human. In doing so, it also provides a small glimpse into what is meant to love God with all our hearts, all our souls, and all our minds. It's a beautiful way to look at it. It's a beautiful way to understand it. Now, what can we learn from it? God takes the initiative in all of our relationships. We are the beloved of God. Beautiful way to look at it. And what does it mean to us? Well, if we just focus on the 6th chapter and the 3rd verse, we hear the beloved must willfully turn and say, I am my beloved's, and he is mine. You know, it just gives all that we need to know. Come away with me, my beloved. That's chapter 8, verse 14. Life in full abundance. And it goes over into the New Testament. Similar wording is found in John 10th chapter and 10th verse. You will find it again in Peter. You'll find it again in many of the writings in the New Testament. It depicts a type of passion that God has for a connection with his people. It describes the love that Christ has for his church. We can look at Ephesians 5th chapter and 32nd verse. It's a profound biblical book when you want to look at it as that out of that context. Life behind walls and lattices, but life out in the open in nature, as wisdom literature was often prone to do. Now, as we go through and we look again um, for a legacy, you know, that we can find out that even when our skin wrinkles with time, our delights will have the memory of the love and passion that we had in our days of our youth. Love is a preserving kind of thing according to this particular narrative. This is a permanence. God ordained love never dies. Instead, it equals death in its power because she says, the bride says, as she is thinking, you know, that it is a strong, her love for her bridegroom is as strong as her love for the bridegroom. Now, moving very quickly over into part two, the blacks in the Bible, they were not white. And this is an article, and this is part three of it, Solomon's Bride. And the focus here is that in the Song of Songs, the black and beautiful that we see in the first chapter, fifth verse, they we see that as being literal. She was black and she was from Shulamite. She was from Shulam. And as we've said that his actual first wife was an Egyptian, and we have the women feminist writers, Alice Bales, who goes on and she writes that the Shulamites had long been known as Pharaoh's daughters whom Solomon married. Um, we have here, and she does such a great job of defending it because there's reference to Pharaoh. She wants him to come, you know, like a mare among Pharaoh's chariots. We have this beautiful imagery here. I would like to look at the reasons why we might see the Star of Solomon's love poem as an African woman. Again, she goes in and she defines what a Shulamite is, and she goes back to First King, where the beloved is mentioned. And it says that Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh of Egypt, and he married the daughter. And we go on down further. We accept that it's a political move, and that Solomon gave his first wife her own palace. It took 20 years to build, but he was so sure that this African woman would be able to manage it. This is the first time we talk about managing a household, but it's her household. Please keep that in mind. You know, it's not like Abigail and Nabal that we talked about earlier in our series. But the black is beautiful, the Egyptian wife, the Shulamite wife. Um, we have the very fact that she is from Shulam. Um, and we go back into, we're able to look at that because Shulam really means peace. And as we go here and we look at the first wife who Solomon took out of Egypt and brought into Jerusalem, which set her apart from the other Jewish women. So her skin tone definitely. For those who say, well, okay, I accept the fact that the the shepherd is out, the lady shepherdess is out in the sun, and that she is tan. But she's the character here in this poem. But we want to know who the bride was. But if we were to do a role reversal, we would accept that Solomon's black bride stands out from the usual Jewish people. And there we have the feminists who take up this argument, and they get to notice that there is a contrast, but there are so many um, commonalities here. And that, please notice in this one, we're not talking too much about submission and dependence in the way that we normally would. This is a girl who wanted a marriage matching her diary, and her future lay in the character of her husband. You know, he uh, he will um, he will create a life for her because he has a life. But the girls were taught, you know, that the women had a very limited sphere of influence, you know, and that was limited to the household. But Here, our character, the Shulamite, here has some royal power as a wife of Solomon, so she does not have to accept the cultural expectations that she's been given. She actually seeks out her betrothed. She goes out looking for him at least two, three times in there. And as we talked earlier about Lady Wisdom in Proverbs, more often she initiates the meeting, rather than Lady Folly, who just Dame Folly, who waits for the men to come and fall into her trap. But here we have Solomon Shulamite, um, who was just remarkable in her presentation. She's a prototype for the woman wisdom in Proverbs 31. That's where we were going with that thought earlier. In Proverbs 31, the woman seeks wool and flax. She brings her food from afar. She considers the field when she buys it. Here we have a woman who is managing a household more and more, more and more. we actually have a comparison to the book of Ruth. So, are we talking about a real black woman? Yes, we are, according to several of the major feminist writers. We are talking about a woman of valor. We are talking about an African woman. We are talking about an African woman who is set in the Middle East as an ideal woman who Solomon found more desirable than most. Although he did pick up other wives, many other, 699 to be exact. One of the things that I would like for you to take from today's webcast is that Solomon appreciated all women, and that this African woman, who was, quote unquote, the model for the bride here in the Song of Solomon in his earlier time, is a prototype for women all over. It became a prototype for the teaching of young girls uh, later. It was not to teach them about sex, but to teach them about how women behaved. I am dark but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar. That's how you know, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not look upon me because I am dark, because the sun has tanned me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyard, but my own vineyard I have not kept. So once she gets married, she knows whether this is Solomon or some other person. Once she gets married, she will be the one who takes care. Here, the bride describes herself as dark but lovely, suggesting a natural beauty, heightened by her hard work in the vineyards. This passage emphasizes her humility and the esteem she holds despite her complexion being darkened by the sun. So, but the groom describes her, as the most beautiful, the fairest among all women. So the color black, being dark, was not something there. So the bride was Israel. If we want to do an allegorical interpretation, the bride is Israel, the bride as the church, the bride as the individual soul, and the bride as someone to study. Please join me for our next webcast. I hope you have enjoyed this one very much. I enjoyed putting it together, the bride and the groom. There's much more to say about them, but join me next time on our webcast, and we will talk about the women in the book of Israel, Isaiah. Thank you, and may God bless you.